Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
How
not
heroic he comes
idiot. If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome back to the Sensible Socialist Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson. And on this episode of the podcast, I bring back on Brandon Madsen from the Reform and Revolution Caucus of DSA, just to kind of talk about a bit of perspective that I've been thinking about recently and wanted to talk to somebody for whom I really appreciate and respect their opinions. And I think Brandon was the perfect person to do it. So we go through a bunch of different topics in this conversation, and I think it was worthwhile to kind of take a 30,000-foot view and to see what that would do in terms of thinking about different options we have politically and strategically and what it is that we should be doing in the next 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 5 years. And I think this discussion is a good primer if you're interested in those topics. And so it's a bit of a long one. It's about 2 hours long, but I hope that you enjoy it. And if you do, consider donating to us at patreon.com/sensiblesocialist. And with that, here's my interview with Brandon Madsen. Well, first, thanks for coming back on the podcast. You're like quite the veteran now. This is like 4 or 5 episodes, I think, that you've kind of been a part of. And so, like I was saying before, I do really appreciate your perspective. I think even with our conversation with Max Blumenthal and stuff, your patience and different things like that I think are good and are helpful and are sometimes not always my strong suit. And so it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm happy we can do it in a way that hopefully other people get something out of.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. So the idea, just to give a background for those that are listening, is we're coming up to the end of the year of 2021, and 2021, started off with a bang on January 6th, and it's been, as every year has been recently, quite the year in terms of what has happened. Coronavirus still going on. We're now coming up against another variant that is already shutting down, the Netherlands and other places, and so there's a sort of feeling that there's never-ending things to talk about and things that advance, and sometimes it feels like, I was telling you, I've been reading a lot of Lenin, and there was one nice thing, I think he really talking about Marx. It's often said that, there's the whole, weeks will happen, years go on when nothing happens in weeks, but that's not actually the quote, it's something different, but it's really, the idea is actually, the larger idea is, in these moments of seemingly retreat, and times in which there isn't obvious revolutionary changes going on immediately or revolutionary actions going on, it's actually the right time to take a step back and to do a bit of go back into either philosophy or to kind of pull back and try to make sure that you really know sort of what's going on and to be able to, I think we would both admit, I imagine it's almost axiomatic that in order to understand what you need to do, you need to understand where you are. And so the idea for me was to try to get down on paper a little bit of where I see where we're kind of at, and hopefully that will inform some, both short-term ideas in terms of what we can do in the next 6 months or a year, but even long-term, thinking about long-term processes to make sure that what we are doing or what we, orient our activity towards in the next short period is relating to a longer program or a longer idea of where we want to go. And so I wanted to make sure that I talked to somebody for whom I respect and who I think has their finger on the pulse in a way that is very helpful to know what to do, and that person is you. So I'll start with, I think it will be taken somewhat for granted by listeners of this podcast, and maybe I should do it. This is always really lame, but I've been very humbled in some ways looking at like years in review of how many people are actually listening to this podcast, and like to those people who are, I've gotten several Instagram messages and emails and stuff of people who really enjoy it, and somebody said it was like their number one podcast on Spotify, which I was very surprised by. It's definitely not, but it's also the case that it may be generating a lot of listens, but it isn't always generating a lot in terms of support. And there is a Patreon page and all that kind of stuff. I'm not doing it for money, but it does take time, it does take effort, and if you do enjoy it, it is a nice way to show that you actually, that you actually really do support it in terms of financially, but not make that small pitch, whatever. But it will go without saying for those that listen that we're going to take a sort of Marxist approach to these kind of things, which involves the use of sort of dialectical thinking and understanding that there's a kind of constant flux of things, and things are always in motion. There are contradictions within almost everything, and realizing those contradictions are very important to be able to see where things have gone and where they are going, and to be able to kind of parse through them in a way that doesn't just assume that something is fixed and will always be some way, that things are constantly changing, and every new thing that comes about produces new situations that produce its own contradictions that will have to get worked out in some way and continue this sort of larger flow. And so I want to put a sort of pin there and say that that's where we're focused on. And the other part of it would be that that there is, I think, again this somewhat axiomatic phrase that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. We have not overcome that period of human history. We are definitely and kind of obviously involved in a period of class struggle, and that is a major orienting aspect of what it is that we're going to see and talk about in terms of what is actually going on in society, and that underneath it all we may see these examples of this, but this is part of a long struggle against particularly in our time, those who own and control the means of production and what they use that power that comes with that, and the rest of us who have to sell our labor power for wages. So I for me, I think, have gone back to reading, Lenin and some Marx and doing that kind of stuff as I've taken a little bit of a break from the podcast and I'm coming back in the later part of this year. And I think that, the thinking about the position of Marx himself actually is always interesting to me because, although, there's obviously not this position of like the great man of history theory where it's just like individuals who make history. It's not just that, but it's not as if individuals don't matter and don't have an impact on how history develops. And so while there is this kind of, these claims about the scientific aspect of historical materialism and these like laws of social development and things like that, I do, it's always been kind of funny to me to really realize how much Marx was unable to appreciate how much change his ideas would have in terms of the development of capitalism itself and the reaction to it and all of these different struggles. Because I think that if there hadn't been Marx himself, you might have seen some of the same things, but it wouldn't have been the same kind of things. I mean, Marx himself is involved in bourgeois revolutions, but having this idea that like, well, I'm already thinking about the next one that's going to happen after that, and how that the fact that these two ideas are existing at the same kind of historical period significantly changes how history has developed and sort of where we've come from. And then you get, the fact that
I'll just cut in to say that, like, I think even in those quote unquote bourgeois revolutions, which is true, I mean, the bourgeoisie came to power in those revolutions, but they couldn't have done it without bringing the rest of the sort of oppressed and exploited classes along with them, and so of course the working class was part of that same struggle.
Yep.
And I think that seeing the working class in motion in that context is part of, it is definitely something that influences Marx's ideas on this point. And
it was a very good experience in the sense of seeing when kind of push comes to shove where liberals will put down, will whether or not they'll side with the working masses or the powers to be. And it's been almost...
For them, it goes up to a certain point and no further. And at that point, okay, it's time to disarm everybody. It's time to go back to
Right.
We've
You
done
know?
what we want to do, and
And like the
now you're on
American
your own.
Revolution is a perfect example, right? This like these very revolutionary ideas, and then immediately once the sort of ability to maintain political power of the small class, it's like, okay, stop, Shays Rebellion and the rest of it, and so yeah, I think but I do think that and I'm curious what you think about this, is that understanding that in the basic position of the development of technology in a certain mode of production, the development of technology in that mode of production will eventually force or make it apparent that the relations of production and all those kinds of things that are related to the mode of production become fetters to the ability for the new kind of technology to really advance, human society, whether that be by creating more wealth or, doing whatever. And I think so, like the one that Marx talked about obviously was industry, and the industrial development. The feudal order was essentially a fetter to the development of industrial production and the capability and the idea that you could, in this moment where there's like a potential for overproduction, but you have this major fetter, which is the whole feudal order and the lack of free trade and all those kind of stuff. And so that what happens is that you have a revolution by the bourgeoisie in general of trying to basically remove the fetters of the old system and implement a new system that is conducive to the development of industrial production, which is the system of capitalism. And I think obviously Marx is correct in the sense that that process of industrial production develops a class that hadn't existed before, an industrial kind of working class that are not in the countryside, the kind of agrarian working class, but actually in the cities and actually doing the production and that kind of stuff. And obviously Marx saw that they were the potential agent for revolutionary change to a new system. But to me, when I think about it, if we think about the technological developments that have happened in the 250 to 350 or 400 years, depending on when you decide capitalism started, there's been to me the what we'd call the technological revolution, or the use of microchips and high data inputs to be able to use data to do a lot of different things, and the development of that. It seems to me that we might see that development, the development of software development and the ability, the labor savings and all that kind of stuff that comes from that, as that capitalism and the capitalist system, as suited to industrial production as it was, is a kind of fetter to what technology could actually provide for us. And Marx had talked about that the technological development is going to be part of what is going to be necessary to be able to have a society where all the needs are sort of being able to be met and people can freely associate their labor. And so, is there a kind of, not to be a revisionist or reformist too much, but is there a need to kind of see this new technological revolution, the microchip or software revolution, or whatever you want to call it, as the new development that will potentially be the means by which a revolutionary change will really be forced from the capitalist system that might be suited for industrial production?
I mean, I think there's never going to be a moment where it's truly forced. I think if left up to the capitalists, like if there's not a, whatever you want to call it, the subjective factor of history or whatever, that aside from the objective developments of the technological forces or whatever, if the working class doesn't actually organize to politically take power and change the social system, the capitalists will totally just drive us into barbarism or whatever. I think that is absolutely another possibility.
Mm-hmm. Marx said you could either get some kind of progression, some kind of system that does take advantage of a new technological development, or you could have the total destruction of everything, which is so what happened.
So like in the ancient slave societies, the fall of Rome or whatever, that's an example of a society where it didn't have a revolution. It just decayed until it was so weak that it could be taken over by the Germanic barbarians or whatever you want to call them from surrounding areas. And that was the only way to sort of refresh the the social development was by infusing from, the conquerors were greeted as liberators at that point, basically, in a lot of the Roman Empire. And so, but here it's not like we have some external alien civilization that we know of waiting to swoop in and redirect or whatever. So the stakes become even higher in that regard. So I do think these new technologies, that they are another leap forward in just intensifying the contradictions between the productive system and the political apparatus that it is saddled with. In that, it's another degree to which you can there's all this stuff that you can produce with very, very little labor, or like a just upfront labor, and then reproduce at little to no cost or whatever. And so you see that contradiction come into play in all sorts of places. Like one of the most obvious is like, entertainment, like music, movies, art, whatever, like that. At this point, you can reproduce all those things once they're digitized at basically no cost. And so by market logic, you shouldn't be able to make money on those things anymore if you just left it up to that. And so obviously the capitalists are, first and foremost, they're about profit. So they're not going to say like, okay, we'll just go with the market logic and let those things be free. They're gonna pass laws that say, actually, we have a legal right to make profit on this. And whatever. But it is just an example of how even by their own, ideology, they sort of can't even stand by their own free market ideology on that. And I think you see that development in general, that as class societies go sort of from their progressive ascendant phase, where they are on the net, a boon to the progressive development of productive forces, and into the phase where they become a fetter. I think you see there's like a moral decay in the class along with that, the onset of more selfishness, corruption, that, I think that the sort of high vistas of like, the great future that we have ahead of us or whatever is like, there's none of that today. Like that was the like feeling, in the ascendant phase of capitalism. The capitalists were zealots, they were ascetic zealots in a way, like that they were all about making profit, but it was about something bigger than like, I'm going to have a big house or whatever. It was like, they really believed there's this.
Now there's this abandonment of Earth, even in the sense that we need to, like Jeff Bezos wanting to get off, to create off Earth technology, like, industry, or like Elon Musk going to Mars. It's like not even trying to make the world better. It's saying the world is so fucked, we're just going to have to leave. It's crazy. But on the issue of like classes and the structure of classes, right? I mean, you tell someone that if you want an introduction to communism or Marxism, read the Communist Manifesto, and there's so many different kind of class structures, but capitalism really boils them down into these two main, bourgeoisie and proletariat. And I think, at the time there was this major transition from the majority agrarian workforce, the working class, right? Because the proletariat doesn't necessarily mean working class. It has a very particular industrial working class, depending on how you read it. So, because there was this idea that like, and I think it's happened in most places in the world where there is really no widespread serf population or, anything like that you do have agrarian workers, but much of that is kind of in the same kind of industrial context. So you've had just to be
explicit for anyone who's listening, I feel like it's important to just draw out that like when Marx is talking about the proletariat, it's defined by the wage labor relation, right? And so, the peasants, the serfs, they were workers in the sense that they did work, but it was not a wage labor context. They were largely like either small proprietors in the case of independent peasants, or were, in the case of serfs, that was its own unique class, exploitation setup or whatever, where they tithe a certain amount of money or product, so it was just a different, it was not a paid by wages for a certain amount of labor power.
Right. And so you might have this pulling away into the vast majority who become wage laborers, who are having to sell their labor for a certain amount of money. and are doing so in a labor market, and then those that engage in that market on the other side of it to actually purchase the labor. You have had in that period of time, and still existing, a middle class between those two, where you have someone who is sort of on both. And there was even in the manifesto, and obviously you can see it all the time, that these people in the middle class are a very interesting group, because they are one bad quarter, or one, missed loan payment or something away from being pulled away from any kind of ownership position and proletarianized, or pulled back into wage labor. Because even if, that's why it's always been frustrating with some people, the capitalists deserve all their money because of all the risk. Well, all they risk is becoming just like the rest of everybody else and become a wage laborer. So I don't think it justifies the massive amount of extraction that they're able to do. But
completely agree.
But the thing I think now, especially in the age of the kind of the Great Resignation and that kind of thing, which is not something super new. There's these events have kind of happened before, but you do have this weird, the weird area of the platform gig economy workers, and the precariat, as they've been called, and the Twitch streamers, and these people who are not wage laborers. They are certainly not really owners. Many of them don't employ many people or something like that. They're using platforms as a way to be paid, but in some ways it's not that traditional kind of wage labor contract, even if it's like a not actually existing contract situation. That seems to be not the traditional middle class of somebody who owns like a store or something and maybe employs a few people, but it seems a bit different. How do you see that development? Is that shifting class relations, or is that a smokescreen of traditional dynamics?
I think so. To take the two separately, I think the precariat example is just the usual. That's the working class. Whenever the working class is not sufficiently powerful and organized enough to like put conditions on employment that to make it more stable, to make it more reliable, then you're going to wind up in precarious positions. That has existed in other points in history. If you read, anything about the sort of early 20th century, US or England in the late 19th century or whatever, like it is a precarious, unreliable existence, and where, a lot of piecemeal sort of labor. And so I think that, the gig economy, there's new technologies involved, certainly, but I think the overall dynamics, that's the working class. And when it comes to Twitch streamers or other sort of content creators where like, you have your own setup with your computer and your camera and your whatever you're doing, and you create that, you own that, and then you sell that in some form to people, either by donations or whatever, or by explicitly pay per unit of something or whatever, depending. And I would say that is a traditional middle class, again, with new technologies involved, but just in terms of the relationship to production, the relationship is you own your means of production, you own the product, and you sell it directly to the consumer. So it's an artisanal thing, and so yes, there's the intervention of these platforms or whatever, but that was true that's always been true of the middle class, that if you were doing it in a physical store or whatever, most middle class, small business owners don't own the store that they're working out of. They rent the space.
Or the farmer's market, that was just a platform to sell your produce.
Exactly. Yeah. And most farmers are deeply in debt. I mean, most small business owners generally are deeply in debt because of the overhead. And so like their drive to make money is largely to make those loan payments and stop them from getting bigger or whatever. In a lot of cases, and so I think, and in many ways, actually, that's a difference in a way. There is some overhead cost for being a Twitch streamer or whatever. You need a certain amount of equipment or whatever, but like compared to renting office building or something. Like it's a pretty manageable
Yeah.
cost, and I think that's why a lot of people are tending in the direction of trying to do that. Is it's still hard to get a business up off the ground, as hard as with anything else, but the overhead is just so much smaller.
Yeah.
And so it's like, why not go for it, especially given the precariousness of the employment market or whatever. And then of course you have, like, on the other side, like the well-off upper layers that are, largely the consumers of these things or whatever, that are the ones, that are sort of bankrolling that, overwhelmingly, I would guess. And that I would guess there's a small number of people that, like, subscribe to a lot of different, podcasts and Twitch streamers or whatever, and, like, are sort of have their money divvied up like that, more so than, like, that.
Right.
I think that's not true for most working class people.
Yeah, the people who do like $100 questions on Twitch streams and stuff like that. I'm always like, holy shit, what are you doing? But it's probably somebody who's, either got a trust fund or, something like that, that's got money to blow, and that's where they want to blow it. It's not that much different than blowing it on a sports car or something like that you don't need. Like, same kind of thing. But how do you see? So to me, I think one of the things that gets a bit frustrating or a bit makes this a bit the standard kind of owning and controlling the means of production and selling your labor is, I think, intentional in some ways, attempts to blur class lines in that sense. And obviously, I think the idea of the 401k and now you see the kind of, the stonk, the GameStop, purchasing of stocks and stuff like that. And the massive, I think, even of especially a certain, what we might call upper crust, and what has been, I think, dubiously the professional managerial class, the ones who are, I was reading Lenin on Lenin's amazing encyclopedia submission for on Marx and what Marx is. And he had this perfect line. He said, there's going to be a certain layer of the working class that the bourgeoisie is essentially going to pay off, that they're going to give higher wages and real benefits so that they can be a fetter to the development of, like, working class solidarity, that you're going to have this bought off layer of the working class that is tied in to that almost feels that it has the same interests as the ruling class. And obviously in the middle class, I mean, to me, it's relatively well established that they have some of the most reactionary, in what we would say conservative, but definitely reactionary, views. They're very often not super proletarian focused or something like that. Some of the highest exploitation rates are in small businesses and things like that. That's where you're getting low wage labor and those kinds of things. But you have, 401k investments, stock plays, these kind of, like, the attempt to say, oh, you do for to get your money, have, engage in wage labor, but you use that to purchase ownership stake in companies. And so now you're, like, kind of a worker and kind of an owner. Do you think that that's just intentional kind of bullshittery, or, like, how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, there's people who really believe that, but, like, if you're talking about the, like, actual, like, people who know their stuff of the capitalist class or whatever, like, they know that's crap. This same talking point has been around for more than 100 years. Rosa Luxemburg already tackled it in Reform or Revolution, where she basically takes, this was one of the arguments Bernstein was making at the time, that well, look, like, stock ownership like, there's more people than ever that are owning stocks, and like, doesn't that show that actually, there is more mobility here with it? Like,
we could all just become, like, progressive investors, right?
That capitalism is sort of overcoming some of the supposedly unovercomable contradictions, and it can lead to, like, this new better thing, and this is a sign of that we can just do things gradually through capitalism or whatever, to get to socialism the slow way. So Rosa Luxemburg totally demolishes that, and I probably won't do as good a job as her, but I mean, basically she says that, like, when you're speaking like, that it's actually showing not that is not a spreading out of the wealth of society or of ownership. It's the opposite. It's a concentration. It's because when you think about a capitalist in the modern sense, you're not talking about an individual. You're talking about an economic entity. And right now, most of the big capitalists are not individuals. They are corporations. They are corporate persons in the not in the more objective economic sense of that. Anyway. But and so insofar as they suck up more and more small capitals or whatever into their gigantic capital or whatever, insofar as a single corporation is glomming together of more and more of these small capitals, that is not a process of spreading out of wealth and control and ownership. That is a concentration where more and more people's wealth is going towards the ownership and control of the small number of people that actually run the corporation, right. And so yeah, I mean, owning stock, I mean, and then of course there's just the buying and selling of stocks, which is just that's like gambling. It's like saying a worker goes to a casino, so they're not a worker or whatever, which is also not true. So I think on both those fronts, it's total crap. But
so you don't buy the whole empowerment of the regular Joe against the hedge fund via GameStop or something like that. I wonder how you think about that.
I mean, I think the GameStop insurgency thing was, I mean, that was a real thing. Like that was, people, but it was, I mean, it was market manipulation, and the reason it was satisfying is because it's something that the elites like always do anyway. And so it was satisfying just to be like, as a screw you, like we're gonna make your shorts fail or whatever. But then of course it also became like a thing that people jumped on to try to individually make money or whatever, and sort of and I think in the end, like, it didn't disrupt the system overall. It was just sort of and in fact there was sort of a crackdown in the aftermath or whatever to try and make it harder for that to happen in the future.
Just blew apart this whole notion that like these are actually like people who believe in free markets and things like that too, right? Because as soon as you have like any disruption of the ability for the market to be controlled by the powerful entities, it's like, oh no, we have to flick off the switches now. Stop, potentially disrupting these because it has to survive.
And I think actually in the era we're in, we're going to see in general a going away of the free trade ideology and a move towards protectionism on an international scale. More openly, just because I think that's the intensification of international competition is one of the driving sort of factors of capitalist crisis and the sort of clogged market, and that's what drives wages and benefits down or whatever. And I think there's going to be a reaction to that in terms of, I mean, I think you're already starting to see it, that just the rhetoric is more in the direction of suspicion towards other countries and the need to put America first,
especially in the formerly like leader of that kind of system. When you have an ascendant, in China and other places, when you have that ascendancy and it's a genuine challenge, and it's like, whoa, like free trade worked really well when people were making lots of money and stuff like that, but now like we're seeing that shift where China is able to like ramped up its consumer commodity production in always directed towards fulfilling their own kind of market, and they were just getting all of the investment and stuff like that to do that from like short-sighted capitalists from the United States of America. And like, to me, and now all of a sudden you're saying like, oh wow, like now we're going to start to lose on that, so now we've got to, I guess, try to bring it all back.
And it's like, yeah, there's no solution either way. Like, yeah, free trade comes with these issues, but protectionism will come with issues too, that neither one's going to solve the fundamental underlying problems as long as you have a society based on the contradiction at the root of capitalism, where you have, socialized production but private appropriation. That's what's in the final analysis driving the problems, but they're sort of, the capitalists, because of their social position, are like incapable of seeing that or admitting that to themselves, so they try and find other solutions. But but I think it is interesting that you see, I think one of the major sort of developments that's important for understanding the juncture we're at is that the sort of neoliberal order, the neoliberal regime or consensus is sort of, it's dead or dying at least. Nothing new has come to replace it. They haven't figured, it's just sort of now they're just stumbling and groping at this point. But like the whole neoliberalism, the core of that was the idea like we need stable money at all costs. We need price stability, and everything gets subjected to that. But I think ever since the 2008 crash, you've sort of had the tinder built up for blowing up that whole framework. And now with the pandemic, it's like you couldn't have stable money if there's nothing you can do to have stable money. It's just not a viable priority anymore. And so, I think we're in a period where the ruling class is like trying to figure out, and different wings are putting forward different ideas or whatever, but no one sort of has a clear, confident answer to like what's next.
And it reminds me of, if you're at all interested in studying the history of revolutions, this is one of the main, it's almost always where the political system is essentially bankrupt, not only morally and even politically in terms of its inability to genuinely control things, but actually financially. And I think that it's relatively obvious to me that the U.S. government in particular is all but bankrupt. It says obviously there's no kind of like book or ledger generally, like you got a budget or something like that, but where they want to remove even like the ability to make any kind of increase in the debt ceiling. Like they just wanted to make it automatic because it's like I understand why you'd want somebody to be like, hey, do we really want to like continue that process? Because like, if you're going to get in debt forever, you're going to fail. But it's sort of like, well, we can't have any kind of limitations on that because we have to. We're in a process of essentially like, I used to back in 2008 time when you'd have strategic defaults, when you would literally ramp up your debt because you knew you weren't going to pay it back at some time. I feel like that's essentially sort of what we're doing, and that leads me to the kind of next even aspect of just looking at the political situation in the United States, because there was, I think in the insane exuberance in the post Cold War era of the the Fukuyama end of history, we've won, and the neoliberal consensus and that, like you said, is breaking down. And I think when you look at there was that consensus even between the two parties in the United States, which again, it's always frustrating when people complain about other one-party states because the United States is essentially a one-party but two-faction. It's a sort of two questions of where you approach liberalism. Do you have a more oriented towards like letting the market do its thing and sort of using the state to help develop private individuals who are owning and controlling the means of production, or do you do something akin to social democracy? And I think in the United States, the crazy thing is, you don't even have a social democratic party, which is an attempt by liberals to save capitalism. So we don't even have that. So we really have like a single conservative party with a slightly less conservative wing and a more conservative wing. And
it's definitely two factions representing this same class interests.
Exactly.
It's two different ideological factions of the same class.
Like bourgeois liberalism, it's the two sides of bourgeois liberalism. But the weird thing is, I think obviously inside the Democratic Party, you have a social democratic, still liberal, still not going to genuinely challenge like the kind of fundamental contradiction of social production and private exploitation or expropriation, but at least attempting to limit as much as one can the dire consequences of that inherent contradiction within the Democratic Party, embodied by maybe 10 or 15 members of it in terms of the electoral, right? But it's always they get the squad and other people get a lot of attention, which I guess is good, but they are a significant minority, and they are obviously unable to really do anything. And obviously there was a big controversy on the left as to whether or not you force votes on things by withdrawing and doing these kind of parliamentary technique. And one argument was, well, it's not going to fundamentally change anything anyway, so what does it matter? And the other one was like, well, at least you should try to do fucking something. But I think there was a recognition that it wasn't going to ultimately matter. And when push came to shove, they didn't do that kind of stuff because they are subservient to the majority of the Democratic Party. And so, and then there's this interesting thing on the conservative side of it, of the influence of Trump and a kind of neo-fascism even within that the conservative movement. And they you've got also like the rejection of social democracy on the Democratic side in favor of a kind of, I would say, sort of pandering to identitarianism in some ways, of like trying to cover up the fact that you're not actually doing anything fundamentally reforming, and what you really want to do is simply put the right faces in the right positions, and that'll somehow be progressive, that's what progressive means. And then you have on the conservative side, people who are more traditionally what I would say bourgeois liberal, in the sense of like trying to just make sure that the government can maintain the market kind of at all costs and maintain market relations, and give government incentives and investments so that like private business can grow, but then you have this whole other wing that is like even suspicious of bourgeois liberalism and wants to I'm not exactly sure even what they really want. I mean, obviously some of it really revolves around Trump, and Trump never seemed to really have a kind of genuine ideology other than sort of power for its own sake and protectionism. And so I'm curious just how they obviously agree on the American empire and the need to maintain and grow. And there's, again, this year, another 770 fucking some billion dollars that are going to go into an already extremely bloated and unnecessary military regime and bases all over the world and all that kind of stuff. They basically agree that the taxes need to be lower on rich people. In terms of even the CARES Act and this Build Back Better is really just a huge amount of public-private partnerships where the government just gives money to private organizations. There's no like creation of public anything really. And so there's a lot of agreement between them on some of these basic things. And a lot of the differences that we see in terms of the heat, which isn't producing a lot of light, is really on issues of identity or social position that are not really related to genuine economic questions, but are kind of a cover for the maintenance of massive exploitation and social, economic, cultural, and political degradation.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, the reason you don't see a real difference on sort of the fundamental economic questions is just obviously because the two sides are based on the same fundamental economic class. And so, yeah, they find other things to win voters with or whatever. But that's why I think it's really important to develop, a force in society that is based explicitly and clearly on the interests of the working class and says so, and that puts forward genuine economically transformative things that are going to be in the interests of everyone, and at the same time takes up the fights against all the different forms of special oppression in society, fights on the issue of abortion, fights on the issue of inequality in policing and prisons, fights, on like not ignoring those things, not going to the lowest common denominator, but taking up all of those fights of the sort of individual sections of the working class, but then tying them together with these sort of overarching class demands also. And I think if there was a force like that, it would absolutely be attractive in a way that the main parties aren't. Like, it's not that the two main parties are like super popular, it's the opposite.
Exactly.
Like, people just don't see anything else that's viable, but like the majority of people wish there was something that was better than either of those two. And so it's just a matter of giving them something that is that they think like, okay, this is legit, and not a total has some chance of actually doing something.
But we've got a situation where the two political parties are not popular. Congress has, when he was alive, I always loved saying that Congress had a lower approval rating than Fidel Castro did. But they're not popular. They're kind of, it's like, I think for a lot of people, it's relatively see-through. Most people have just withdrawn from political participation because they don't see that their participation will matter. And so we have elections too that are now essentially dubious because on both sides that there's people don't trust the supposed base of the whole political system, which is like elections, that these elections should be free and fair and open, and they've almost never been. They've been almost always controlled by parties and apparatuses, and now after the like solidification of the Republican and Democratic parties who run elections, essentially, that they're almost the only ones really allowed. And you see sometimes, very, very infrequently, parties or it's like groups, usually individuals, who break through that. You see the Bernies in some ways, which is, at least in the campaign of the elections, does not run as a Democrat. You see Shama and a few other people, Shama Sawant in Seattle, for those that don't know. I mean, she did survive just barely her recall election. And she's obviously an insurgent in a way that is very unique and very rare, but is also, in that sense, be able to have a spotlight that is both good and bad, in the sense of coalescing negative forces against her, which is what the recall election was, but also potentially coalescing forces in favor, which is probably why she did survive the election ultimately. But the elections rarely result in any kind of genuine policy shift. It is the kind of continuation. And you see now, I mean, it's not as if Joe Biden has done anything in terms of even that he promised that's even, what he could do. And I think any of us who have student loans are significantly pissed off that like, not only is that going to restart, but the press secretary just the other week said it was a fucking priority to get it to start, and so you've got a groundswell, a huge amount of people who are at least don't care, at least have been so turned off because they just don't see it as going to change, or they're significantly frustrated. But although we've seen growth in DSA, and then there are some like smaller, anti-capitalist organizations that, Socialist Alternative does have a candidate, but it is still very small and intentionally a cadre organization and stuff. So you don't see the SPD of old rising, right? And I'm curious, it seems like we've got the perfect conditions for that to become a major force, and yet we're not seeing it become one. And why is it? I doesn't see that I don't see it. Maybe I'm naive in this, but I don't see the kind of even almost necessity for the FBI to ramp up the COINTEL program anymore. Though you do see some weird things happening with some like people being killed in the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff like that. But I think there is some derailment on the focus of identity concerns but also the ability for the way in which people actually get information to hide or like not promote those kinds of things. They are not making the kind of flashy things that are getting the attention, or that there's a concerted campaign by these organizations to not highlight them. And there's also infighting and potentially a lack of resources. Those are some of the things, but I'm curious why you think even DSA has not been able to run its own candidates and have electoral success, despite it probably having widespread support on its policy positions.
I mean, yeah, I think the reasons are more fundamental in a way, in that, and I mean, yes, these things exist that you cited, but like the infighting and whatever, but I think I would think of it as there's sort of a triple crisis among the working class. You have a crisis of leadership, a crisis of organization, and a crisis of consciousness, and those are all linked together and impact each other, obviously. But the situation is more complicated than at many periods in the past, where the famous revolutionaries we know are writing about, like whatever Trotsky in the transitional program famously said that I'm paraphrasing here, but that the historical crisis of mankind, boils down to the crisis of proletarian leadership, and I think that's not true at our juncture. I think like at the time there was more truth in that you had more in the way of filled out unions and mass working class parties in different countries, not in the U.S. but in other places in the world, and that like the primary thing was, the reformist and Stalinist leaders, leading those things in the wrong direction, leading them to defeat after defeat.
Yeah. The Spanish Civil War.
And so like but I think today there's more layers on top of that we're starting from, a very low level of consciousness, low level of experience in any kind of struggle among the broad masses, given the period that we're coming out of, the historic low point of social struggle following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in that period of capitalist triumphalism, I think we're still there's been a generational break where we're sort of starting from ground zero or whatever, and having to reinvent the wheel or whatever. And so we're still dealing with that, and there's been progress. And the fact that DSA exists in its reincarnation that it has now of 100,000 members, that is a change from the whole past historic period. But there's definite limits to it. We're definitely still in an infantile stage, and so the things you describe about the lack of clarity and the infighting and the inability to actually get practical things done or whatever, I would say these are trademark qualities of an infantile stage of development of a socialist movement or whatever. And you saw those even worse in a way in the Occupy movement, and that was an even more infantile stage or whatever, which is not I don't mean that as a one-sided pejorative. I mean that in both senses, that it is a rebirth. Occupy was a rebirth, and DSA is a rebirth of these things, but you can't expect things are not born as fully fledged adults. Things, and so there are going to be lots of growing pains to get through. But I agree. I think objectively the circumstances are there for an alternative to be offered for the working class that represents the working class, that it could be very successful. But subjectively, it's not there. And I would say that even if we had something like the SPD, I think that's not good enough either, as we've seen with what happened with the SPD, right. In Germany, and more to the point, and recently, what happened with Syriza in Greece, that it's not enough just to have a party that generally opposes capitalism, that has mass electoral support or whatever, that even then, if you don't have sort of the caliber of revolutionary leadership that you need, that it's still, you're going to get these parties in power, and they're going to hand power right back to the capitalists. They're going to carry out the agenda of capitalism, because they frankly don't have a plan other than trying to manage capitalism better or whatever once they're in power. And that's where the distinction becomes really important between your social democrats or whatever and your revolutionaries. I think the positive thing about DSA is that it's not sectarian, so it's a broad tent, that is able to be attractive in that way. But yeah, the flip side is that there's not enough clarity, not even close. It's a total, and because of that, it's not able to take decisive, unified action and get things done. And so I think we have to just be open about those drawbacks. I mean, as a DSA member myself that believes in people joining DSA, I'm not trying to slander it. I just think we need to be open about any organization of that size, any socialist organization of that size at this historic period would be faced with those same problems. And so, it's not a matter of, it's this or that foible of this organization that needs to be fixed. These are the problems that need to be worked through by the movement in general, one way or another. And so, yeah, I think that's why I'm in DSA, and why I feel like try and put some effort into bringing it in what I would see as a healthier direction that's able to play more of the historic role that needs to be played. But there's a lot of steps towards that to be made.
When you look at the history around, especially these moments of inflection of revolutionary change too, that we had said, there's going to be these long periods of time in which either reaction is the name of the game, or that it doesn't feel like there's lots of progress. And that's the time in which you need to organize and get your perspectives and programs kind of together, so that when the moment ripens, in some ways, you're able to reap the harvest or whatever. And I
And
think
I do think we're in kind of a lull right now.
I do
in
too.
this moment. And I think, and that's, DSA's growth has plateaued at this point, and
Yeah.
just social movements in general, I feel like are there's exceptions. There's flare up. There's been some good labor struggles that have had some good energy, but
Sure.
but on the whole, there hasn't,
There isn't something like the Hungry 40s, which is which is a major economic issue that really revolutionizes people. There isn't a giant world war that is really, and I have in my many years as a Marxist or socialist flirted with kind of accelerationist kind of things, in which I don't think it's a good idea politically or tactically to attempt to speed up what is, I think, the inevitability of the inability of the system to actually fundamentally properly react to crises that it not only produces because of its own contradictions, but will come out of climactic shifts, or as we see, a pandemic. And I think a pandemic as a crisis point is actually not the most fertile ground to actually produce a kind of revolutionary response, because it does tend to kind of clamp down and force lockdowns, and it doesn't allow large groups of people to get together who are kind of angry, and you have to do it through whatever means you can. But I think it has had a consciousness raising effect on a lot of different people, the pandemic, and the inability, the fact that our political system is essentially a fetter to being able to react properly and to be able to have a sort of human response to a significant human crisis. But
I think you can often have political radicalization even in periods of low activity or whatever. That I think the period in the aftermath of the 2008 crash, between 2008 and 2011, before the Wisconsin uprising and the Occupy movement broke out, I think like that was a period where people were radicalizing against the political system and drawing conclusions or whatever, but hadn't moved into action yet.
And there wasn't a ready-made organization by which they could just kind of become a part of. And maybe, DSA is potentially finding its role, or there is the groups in DSA that are potentially finding that role to be able to do that in a way that is much like, if we had another 2008-esque thing, I think a lot of people, Trump was in some ways, I think, a political crisis in many people's mind, and it significantly shot up. I made a sarcastic tweet that I'm going to be very interested to see the rise in DSA's membership once the student loans become, because I do think that those are these kind of flash in the pan moments are radicalizing for sectors for which the crises that's happening is acutely affecting, parts of the working class, and those parts of the working class will more and more become radicalized. And at minimum right now in America, like you said, the growth of DSA is really important because it's a place for those radicalized people to get into and be exposed to anti-capitalist arguments and pro-socialist arguments in the way that they are not in school or in the media or in almost anywhere else.
Yeah, and I think also just a place that, again, DSA has work to do in this regard, but a place that ideally can provide a space for democratic debate and discussion and working out of positions, and testing ideas against each other, and taking experiments together and reviewing them together, and just a place to strengthen ourselves and process things. But
I wonder if you feel like the fact that there's now had to be 2 years of online conventions has potentially limited or frustrated the robustness of those kind of debates. And to me, I was frankly highly disappointed by what came out of this year's DSA in terms of some of the positions, specifically regarding the position towards the Democrats, which I know was an important issue for you and was an important issue for me. And I tried to get people to vote in the way that I thought was the right way. I don't know if you think that the fact that we're having to do this, we can still do it because we have the online avenues to do it, which is nice, but it's not the same as getting hundreds of people together in a room, and actually having those discussions.
That's true. The online absolutely doesn't help at all. That it's the fact that things are online it also just makes debates like more distorted or whatever. Like people just it gets more personal and heated more quick. Like you just say things to people online that you don't like if you're in the same room as them.
Yeah.
Or at least most people.
Yeah.
and so yeah, I have noticed just, yeah, there's just more, things are just more tense and in that way. But also I think the more fundamental thing about the convention was just that, which applies to in person and online, is just that one thing I would change is that right now the conventions are just totally built around like uh, individual resolutions. Like all the discussion is like for and against this particular resolution all the time, and that's not just conventions. That's just like how things are in DSA generally. I feel like that's every discussion has to be through the lens of like for or against this organizational measure or whatever, and there's not much space for just the types of open-ended political discussions like you and I are having right now, like or even on more narrow topics, but without like the pressure of, and at the end of this we're going to vote on something or whatever. There's no like space where you're like, yeah, we just debate and try and work out our general political foundations that could then inform decisions we might take in the future, like on the basis of more political clarity. But we just try and jump straight to the organizational resolutions on things and skip the process where we like clarify what the political trends are and like have the broader debate, right?
Yep. I literally finished reading Two Steps Forward, One Step Back about that whole, the 1903 Second Congress. And it's like, obviously it was always a bit confusing to me, like, why was there such a split? But then when you read about it, it's like, you have, yes, some of these like seemingly procedural things about, party rules and whether or not we have freedom of language or whatever, but what happened in terms of those there was enough of the ability to have discussions on it that trends emerged and differences that became Menshevik Bolshevik, and that you were able to kind of see that happen. Now, of course, there was like 30 people there, right? So it's a different dynamic. But I think if you have the space to be able to have open-ended discussions that might start one discussion that seems, I think even Lenin used trifling matters, expose trends that are able to kind of coalesce into larger things that, may or may not be somewhat helpful. I think that there's a certain degree that the Menshevik-Bolshevik split was helpful. There was other ways I think that it was detrimental, but at least it was clarifying.
In the long run, it was clarifying and helpful. In the short term, it was messy and it was totally unclear. And I think
didn't give Markov eventually.
Lenin didn't want it. He didn't want it to be a split. Like in the aftermath of that, he tried to smooth things over. He tried to offer all sorts of organizational concessions to the other side, which ended up backfiring or whatever, because anyway, that's a
heated
whole thing.
Debate.
But
yeah,
because they were not similarly generous or whatever. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that I always at every opportunity try to like drive home about Lenin, because I feel like it's misunderstood and also really important, is that like on principle he was like super firm and like would take every single opportunity to hammer home what he thought the right ideas were, but on organizational questions he went out of his way to like be conciliatory and like not polarize around that if possible.
And I think it was a perpetual frustration of his that you'd give these olive branches and they would just not be reciprocated, and so it was like, all right, well, I fucking tried, but you know what, at this point, like, fuck you, we got to do it ourselves because you won't come along.
Yep. And so I think like, it he was totally flexible on organizational and tactical stuff while being super intransigent and firm on political principle, which I think like, to me, that's the model for a healthy approach in general, that you stick by your political principles while being very flexible and open on secondary things.
So the last bit of a kind of bit of an analysis on where we are, and we've already talked a bit about getting to where we need to go, but I think it's to focus on some of the economic trends that we're seeing pretty quick. And, we did talk about the larger sort of, I think, neoliberal shift in the United States, especially away from your sort of general consumer commodity production into the production of, durable goods like airplanes and things that are not, you're not making a lot of toys and things that you sell at Walmart in the United States, but you might be making even less so, backhoes and some of airplanes and things like that. And then obviously to technology, and U.S. is a major technology hub in terms of software development and Apple and Google and all that kind of stuff, and then service industries and just general service industries, entertainment, and that kind of stuff. And that's been a large trend movement away from your standard industrial production for the consumer economy into a kind of specialized division of labor generally in terms of your economic position. But the production of those consumer commodities comes from offshore. You've got this major increase in the sort of supply chain system to make sure that you can connect where production is happening to where consumption is happening. But that there's been a tendency, I think, for lower quality goods in general, in the drive for like cheaper prices, and all of the externalities that come with the establishment of these global supply chains and the environmental effects of all of that kind of stuff. And what that's done, though, I think, especially in the United States, has consolidated the power of the larger labor force, or of the working class in these particular kinds of sectors. Particularly, I think, the supply chain workers, from the people on the Maersk ships coming around, the people in the Amazon warehouses, the UPS, FedEx, and even now Amazon and USPS drivers that are delivering all the stuff that's actually how we're consuming most of our goods. The internet service provision, people who are actually running servers that are the ISPs, and the ways that we actually are making calls and getting things from the servers. Not to mention, it was 2 weeks ago or something, one of the areas in AWS went down and like a quarter of the internet stopped working. That's wow, the power of the ability to be able to have that kind of light switch on and off. If you were to do that, it was pretty impressive. And then just, the focus on Google and stuff. Jesus, if Gmail goes down for a day, the economy can grind to a halt. So you have these, and then just the other aspect that we even talked about, the gig economy workers and the platform workers, right? If you had, the consolidation of this is in one way precarious, because if something like an AWS outage that isn't intentional happens, you have a disruption that wasn't potentially planned, or at least, you didn't say like next week on Tuesday, Amazon's going down. And like to show your power, it was like something fucked up and it was a big deal and it caused all kinds of disruption. So you have these major disruptive potentials in kind of a few select areas. And so it seems like the perfect place to focus organizing those people into becoming more confrontational. And you see it to a certain degree at Amazon. Obviously there's fighting back, but in some ways, specifically in the warehouses and stuff, which is obviously where the rubber hits the road of the exploitative nature of Amazon. And you have some connections with the other aspect of Amazon in terms of the tech workers and the whole Amazon Web Services industry and stuff like that, which is good. There's those kind of connections, but there still is that differentiation between what might look like the kind of older industrial proletariat who are on their feet doing work with their hands and stuff, to the either the professional managerial class or the kind of technocrariat or whatever you want to call it, that has more technological, that is playing that technological role in that growth of the economy. But it seems like you could have a situation where a concerted effort of organized labor in like 3 individual sectors could disrupt the economy in a way that a general strike of old was necessary to do. That you essentially can force a general strike, not mandating that that a significant section of the working class choose to engage in that strike, but are essentially all but forced to by the fact that more organized and militant, what we have realized in the pandemic, these essential workers take up the mantle of saying, well, if I'm essential, I need to be, I'm going to show you my power, and I'm going to take it down in order to get at minimum concessions, if not, as we've seen general strikes being preludes to significant political change.
Right. Yeah, no, I totally agree that those industries you mentioned are absolutely pressure points that are like, have outsized power. And I think it's always been the case that there have been certain, the working class, the interests of the working class might be united. Not every job is as, crucial to the functioning of the overall economy as every other job.
Yeah.
And so there are some sectors where you get have more oomph in terms of if you were to disrupt it, it would cause real problems for business as usual to continue.
The railroad
And
workers of old, as
exactly, yeah. And so I think like the ones that are more established, I'm thinking mainly of like the dockyard workers or whatever, like those tend to be, they've already sort of done a good job of leveraging that position for their own personal pay or whatever, like that can make $100,000 a year or more as an ILWU, longshoreman. But like, yeah, the same thing has not been achieved in Amazon warehouses or whatever, despite having, somewhat more spread out, but still pretty concentrated power or whatever. Like, and I mean, there's probably more warehouses than ports, but still, it's still a big impact. It'd be, a couple warehouses go down and it's still like billions of dollars, every hour probably that are being disrupted, which is the case at the ports. It's an hour of just like billions of dollars of lost revenue. So it's that's how they're able to leverage that. But yeah, so I think that's real. But then of course the step would but then what neither of them have really done, and which would be ultimately necessary, is to use that in a political way. That's not just used like, okay, I'm going to get better pay and benefits for me because of this position that I have, which I think is ultimately the capitalists can deal with that. If they need to, they can pay off this or that section of the working class, like you said. They won't if they don't have to, but if they have to, they will. But yeah, to use it more as a way to leverage that position to disrupt things with political demands for the working class, and ultimately for the working class to take power. Like, yeah, I think that those are real things that will have to happen. Like, those are the types of things where if you were going to take over, if you were going to try and have a revolution, you would want to secure those areas. I mean, the other one in that vein, I guess, would be like the banking sector or whatever. You'd want to take that over quickly, because that's often anyway.
And I hadn't had this on the list of few things that we were talking about, but also, the military and the police force, which is obviously right now, there's lots of debates in both smaller and I think even in DSA and stuff like that in terms of how you relate to the police force and the military, But if you look at certainly any other revolution and any of the revolutions that have succeeded, it has not been without a significant amount of support from at the end of the day where the power really rests, which is, as Mao sort of said, at the barrel of a gun. And I think obviously we are in a place where this is not unique to us necessarily, but the military and the law enforcement sectors of our society are very conservative, if not reactionary. There were many people in the January 6th incident who were, active military members and stuff. And so that's kind of interesting in the sense that maybe there's not this significant loyalty that we thought to the Constitution per se, but that I don't
think it's that uncommon I think it's the norm in normal periods that the police especially, and to a lesser extent, but still significant, the military, like that those are reactionary, disproportionately reactionary sections of society. I think that's true in normal periods in basically every country. That it's more like in a revolution where the masses that are normally the masses get broken out of their normal positions, into something else. So I think it's true that revolutions do depend on there being enough sympathy within the armed forces and or police that they essentially get heavily neutralized as repressive forces,
or overtaken by an armed working class.
Yeah, exactly. Neutralized enough that the working class isn't having a straight up, full. They're not up against the full military force of those things or whatever. And ideally enough sympathy that they're helping to arm the workers or whatever, that a section of them are helping to arm the workers and train. But but anyway, I think like, so yes, that's true. But I think that usually happens in the course of the revolutionary upsurge. It's not something that has traditionally been like prepared in some earlier period, like by a
Yeah.
slow radicalization.
Yeah, the police are the
within
ones raiding
or
the
whatever.
meetings. They're not usually coming to the meeting going, yeah, you guys got something here.
So just like a partial thing that shows that to me is like, um, when there was the uprising in Wisconsin against Scott Walker's anti-union bill in 2011, that was, I saw something that I've never seen before or since in that situation, which was I saw the head of the police union go into the occupied Capitol building, get up on a megaphone in front of the crowd and say like, when we took an oath to protect and serve, we meant all of you, pointing around to the protesters, not Scott Walker. We know who he serves,
Wow, yeah.
like, just total. And the police in Madison were not reliable as a force to police the Capitol protesters, so they had to bring in police from other areas to be able to have police that will actually play the role they wanted the police to play, or whatever. And so, that didn't stop them from, in the period immediately prior to that, doing the same, racist repression against Black people in Madison, and didn't stop them afterwards, after that period had been over, from continuing to crack down on protesters or whatever. But in the midst of that moment, when there's this mass radicalization and activity, and the masses that are usually passive are brought into active politicization and activity, that's when that the police and the military are drawn from the overall population, and so you get that they get infected with it too. But just as it's a passing thing in the general population, it's a passing thing, in those forces, and so it doesn't change their underlying character in any way. In fact, yeah, the underlying character of the police and the military stays the same the entire time. It's just that the people that fill it out become less reliable as agents of that thing. And so, which I think that's another mistake that gets made, is that in the sort of heat of revolutionary upsurges, I think you saw this in Egypt in 2011 to some extent, that there's sort of, you get illusions in like, because the military is so supportive or whatever in that moment, that like, oh, the military is good actually. And they're our friends.
They're with us, yeah.
And that might be true of individual soldiers, but it is absolutely not true if the military is an institution. And you need to keep those things separate in your mind the entire time.
Right.
And so it does not mean because there's these individual soldiers that are siding, even if it's a lot of individual soldiers, it does not, even if the majority were to side with the protesters, it still doesn't change the character of the military as an arm of the capitalist state. And so,
as much as you had the Kronstadt workers or the Kronstadt soldiers, right? You had a significant amount of the former Tsarist military go to the White Army and become its, so it's, I completely agree with you. I think to try to move, I guess, the conversation, I think we've rounded out. The last little bit I think I had in my little thing was just thinking about the kind of social aspects of all of this, of the economic problems and the political problems and even the cultural problems. Like, what is it even to be an American, and what does all that mean? It's sort of like not even really, it's hard for anyone to really know, and there's a million different ideas in terms of what that means in terms of culture, or whatever American culture even is. I think it just seems to me that that you're seeing a lot of really negative consequences of the social system that we have. Massive just social division, an opioid crisis, people being sort of addicted to either opiates or even social media and being distracted constantly all the time. We have a massive increase in like suicide rates generally. The life expectancy went down for the first time since like the Industrial Revolution. And you see the rise of Trump, January 6th, this new fashion. You had people walking around with very fascist, garb walk into the Capitol like last week. There's people are struggling, and a lot of people are struggling and having a real hard time right now. And I just think it's as I think sometimes it's been said of me, and I think that there's a lot of people too who are more of a revolutionary bent, that it's all aggression and fire and anger and want to tear everything down and cut stuff like that. But a lot, like for me at least, it comes from a deep empathy towards the struggles that everybody, like almost everybody, is going to. And like personally for me, if you look at my wage, I'm among the higher end of the pay scale, but I suffer from all of the same issues of alienation and frustration and not feeling like I actually sort of matter, and having to confront paying back student loans and all this kind of stuff. And so even somebody who is on paper among the top echelons of wage earners, it's still a struggle and it's still frustrating, and I've still got a lot of problems. And my empathy towards especially people who have much less than me is what fuels my revolutionary fire. And I think I at least want to kind of place a flag in this conversation to say that while we can somewhat abstractly talk about the political dynamics of things and the economic dynamics, there's real world consequences on real people that we're all suffering. And in some ways, even the so-called winners and even the ruling class of this society are showing that like it's not even really working for them. And they're building bunkers and wanting to go to Mars and, get off Earth and stuff like that, because it's like, this isn't even working for the supposed winners. And
Yeah, I mean,
everybody's suffering.
On a basic human level, I think that's true. I mean, one of the things about class society is that we can't really be people anymore. Or, I mean, obviously we are, but I mean, you can't, it is not a free development of natural humanity or whatever. Like it is, the dynamics that get generated by a class society put us in a position that's like fundamentally different than in our social relation to one another than what has existed for the vast majority of human existence. And so like there is no the people in our society. There's division and alienation and isolation, and the consequences of that are universal. Obviously the severity is differential in various ways. It's not that everyone experiences it the same, but no one is exempt from it, I guess is what I mean.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, I think that's always been true, and it's only become more true in an era of capitalist decay and decline, that I think those features that are always there, just the negative sides, like just become even more intensified as the system becomes more and more rotten, I guess, in the literal sense of overripe, that it's stuck around too long and is rotting on the vine or whatever. And so yeah, I think like I think there's some on the left who have sort of like downplayed the rise in violent crime, for instance, as like, oh yeah, that's just made up talking points by the right or whatever to stoke fear or whatever. But I mean, I think there is a real like alienation going on that reflects, and I think people's fears of that are legitimate and real. And I think if the left's going to be successful, we need to acknowledge and address those head on, not pretend that those aren't real concerns. But but at the same time, like, yeah, we can't, there's no great short-term solution within the current society. Like there's no, like, we're not going to fix that fundamentally. Like we can put some band-aids on it here or there, but if you really want a society where you're not looking over your shoulder and not like feeling like the next guy over is going to stab me in the back or whatever, like, then this isn't the society for that.
Yeah.
You need a transformation if that's going to happen, because it's built in, it's in the DNA of the society that you have that.
I think one of the consequences too is that when this is happening, one of the promises of liberalism and capitalism was that you would move away from sort of traditional tribal associations, and everyone could kind of collect into either national groups or something like that. And I think what we are seeing, and this is, we'll move this into the kind of what to do, but I think, you're seeing a lot of this resurgence of tribalization, and it's coming in different forms, and whether it's, Democrat, Republican, or white and non-white, or whether it's, there's all these kind of differentiations that are happening where people feel disconnected from people that may not look like them or live where they do or have the same perspectives that they do, and that there's an inability to kind of, or bridge that gap. It's becoming harder and harder to kind of break through, and you've got even people in some ways promoting the necessity of not only coalescing in terms of these, dare I say, identity-based groupings, but that's like in some ways the most important. And I think that's very much a reaction to the breakdown of society sort of in general, and that this is a tendency that human beings have, that when the situation gets real difficult, we're looking for the group that can make us still feel like we belong or still feel important, when we might not find that in places that we had found it in more stable, or when the system is in its ascendancy, you can feel like those are less important. But when it's in its decline, we come back into our, what were our kin groups, but maybe are our tribal groups or whatever. And so
that's where I would say, like, postmodernism is really good when it comes to just describing what it's like experientially to be immersed in the symptoms of this rotting society or whatever. It's really good on that point. It's just in terms of pointing a way forward, not so good.
It's a great description. It's not a very good program. And so that's the first thing that I was saying. I think when we're thinking about what a vision of what we can do, and how that will orient what we actually do in the next, again, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 5 years, the subtitle of this whole podcast is the rational left. And I have seen the kind of irrational left be very heightened and focused on these, identity-based kind of things. And what is necessary, I think, for me, is to be very specific about the need to have a sort of cross-cutting organization and cross-cutting perspective that does not privilege one group over the other in terms of whatever identity categories you might want to create, because there's a million of them. But to say that let's find these, it's even using potentially the language of intersectionality. Where are the intersections? Where are the things that we can all find ourselves in, that we can say, yes, you can describe it in the multifaceted way in which you experience these things, but where are the root causes? Where are the deep things that are causing this? And can we orient our coalescing in criticism around those, rather than coalescing them around things that potentially could diversify us, right? And focusing on, not ignoring the white working class, but absorbing the white working class to become just as radical or just as critical or progressive as black workers, as if there is some kind of innate tendency of black workers to be more radical than white workers or something like that. That we understand that there is a stratification in society, and there has been a permanent underclass given the long nature of slavery and Jim Crow and on racial lines, but that what we need to do is genuinely go beyond that by focusing on what unites us rather than what divides us. So as the first thing, I'm wondering what you think about that.
I think it's sort of the devil's in the details on that. And so, like, I agree with the spirit of, like, that, the goal is to unite. I agree with that. The goal is to unite along class lines and across all other divisions. You want to stitch together, a united movement. In terms of what it actually looks like and how you do that, I think we have to be careful when we're talking about like the idea, like, let's focus on the things that unite us. I'm not I may or may not agree with that, depending on what that means exactly. So for example, there are people who would say, when the Black Lives Matter movement, broke out, and you start having these protests against racial inequalities in the police and prison systems, that, like, okay, yes, those are real things, but the way we fight those is we unite along the things that it affect all of us along class lines, and then through that movement we can take on those issues or whatever, which I don't agree with that approach. I think that is a class reductionist approach in my mind. What I would say is, on the other hand, the working class movement should 100% support the Black Lives Matter movement, even while knowing that it is not it is a cross-class movement. The Black Lives Matter movement, it's united around this social issue, and so it involves people from all classes of society, and those different wings of the movement are going to be putting forward different things. And so I think our task as the workers' movement is to support the BLM movement, but also within that to support the working class wing of the BLM movement and try and strengthen that wing and give voice to its interests and concerns. And that sort of thing, by unabashedly and vocally as the workers' movement taking up the struggles of individual oppressed groups among the working class, and that's how you're going to build that type of unity, is by building trust in genuine shared struggle, while also drawing out the class contradictions within those movements and trying to push to the fore the working class interests within those. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't agree on let's try and sort of defocus from these issues that affect these subsections of the working class and refocus on these things that affect the entire working class, but more let's connect those two, but without losing either of them. Let's have, you have the broader workers movement, and let's try and absorb as much into that as possible, but that means taking on board genuinely all the struggles and of those the individual subsections of the working class.
Maybe it shows that I am reading Lenin way too much, but it's that there's a whole section in What Is to Be Done about the idea that, like, there's people that are arguing that they should kind of ignore those, that this particular interest of, like, students, or, obviously in Russia it was a kind of different identity dynamics or whatever, but like that, like, students are organizing on student kind of focused issues, and so, like, well, we're talking about the need for work class stuff, so there's a section saying no, the idea is meet them and say, yes, your student-based issues, or in Black-based issues or trans issues or whatever it is, are important. They are unique. They are something that we should focus on. But then there is this educational aspect or something like that. I mean, the idea is that united in struggle on those particular issues, you can then connect with other people who may not have the particularized identity that is actually suffering the particularized oppression, but in the support of it, that group that may be even myopically focused on the oppression of those groups will realize that, oh, it is connected with other kinds of oppressions, other kinds of issues that are connected by this kind of large scale working class movement. Because, like, diversity, equity, inclusion things are good ideas in principle, but they are also becoming corporate positions, right? And like you were saying, so if there's the ability to co-opt some of these ideas and have it actually serve the interests of the ruling class, there's an opportunity by having a full-throated support for the struggle for Black lives, or the struggle for trans rights, or whatever it is, immigrants' rights or whatever, but to be able to, not necessarily immediately, but in the course of actually organizing and struggling on those issues, to say that yours are not they are the most important and the focal point for you, and then there's a focal point for this other group, and we are sharing in this commonality of struggle, and this cross-cutting allows us to have a united front.
Well, and to be clear, I think we should be politically bold and open with our analysis within participating in those struggles. Like, I think we should argue explicitly that all of these oppressions in society have their very real independent dynamics and existence and affect people of all classes that are in that group or whatever. Nonetheless, the framework on which the background, the whole whatever platform foundation upon which all of that is playing out is this class society. And so that, I think we should be very unambiguous that class is not just one type of oppression among many or whatever, that it is, that yeah, the class basis of society, it forms the foundation for all this other stuff, and that we do need to take that on, that's
Right.
at the root of this. But I mean, I think that's a task that we have to do in every type of movement. Like there's people who are just fighting on some narrow, like, we want a better contract in our union or whatever,
Yeah,
and like that is not challenging fundamentally the class basis of society either. And we're, as socialists, our role within that is to try and put forward that perspective and organize and win the people that we can do that perspective. But it doesn't mean we say, like, oh, we're gonna, like, that union struggle doesn't matter because it's not going to overthrow class society or whatever. We try and use that as, in fact, the only way I would argue that people like draw those farther reaching conclusions, for the most part. There's a few people that draw them through reading and discussion and whatever, but I think, like, the way most people develop new ideas about most things, or have their old ideas shaken up or whatever, is by experience or by these sort of bigger events in society or whatever, things that aren't just us saying something to them or whatever, but something they have to go through. And so I think that's true of every worker. And so, yeah, whether it's in a union struggle, whether it's in a struggle for again, or I should say, a struggle against the inequality in the police and prison systems, if it's a struggle, around abortion or whatever it is, like, those are all places that, whatever the issue is, those are places where radicalization can happen and where people can draw lessons. But it's a lot less likely that's going to happen if socialists are not there, and part of it to sort of help draw that out.
Right.
Because I mean, it might happen if it was uninterfered with, but precisely because it's a cross-class movement, that means that the ideologists of the other classes are certainly going to be there, putting their position forward. And so, do we want that to be uncontested? I don't.
I mean,
I want to be there to be able to put forward the working class perspective.
That's the frustration with it. I think a lot of this is the co-opting of many of them to continue to serve the interests of. It's like, oh, these are really important movements, but, like, the idea that, a Black Lives Matter protest is used as the backdrop for a Pepsi commercial is that's the kind of thing that, we need to fight against, and we need to have the correct strategy to do so, and not standing on the, not just sort of standing on the outside of those groups going, oh, no, you're not sufficiently class focused, is not the strategy to combat, because the ruling class isn't saying, oh, you're there's a kind of, like, congratulations, you're not sufficiently class focused. Please, like, so, it's a needle that you have to thread, but I think it's an important one. So in some ways, to, like, quickly go through a few of these things, because I think I'm interested in your perspective on organizational questions of the idea of a single organization. On DSA, I guess, in particular, do you see DSA as an organization that allows for, discussions and kind of maybe bringing out differences of opinion to find a group of people that have, in some ways, the right perspective or the right orientation that will be able to, on its kind of own, move things forward? Do you think it's DSA as a large tank group that could do that? Because to me, it seems that what needs to sort of happen is that there's a two-step, essentially, kind of approach that will allow more potentially radical ideas to become more mainstream, and it could be through DSA, which is, I think DSA right now is very obviously oriented in a social democratic way, a very Bernie-esque democratic socialism being a euphemism for social democracy, like wanting healthcare, nationalized, well, not even nationalized in terms of Medicare for all, but some kind of guaranteed healthcare, guaranteed higher education, some of these traditional social democratic ideas, which are, I think, generally popular and would get a lot of support as a step kind of one in order to give some kind of credence or political legitimacy to some of this idea. Because if you begin your discussion, as I have sometimes done, with people saying that what I want to do is illegalize private ownership of, private business ownership, that doesn't always work as a good first step in trying to convince someone to come on board with your organization. And so there does seem to me, though, a need eventually to distinguish these social democratic and actual socialistic ideas, because there's been a significant muddy of the water in terms of what socialism kind of actually means. And it's been, I think, much muddied by the fact of DSA's continued linkage with the Democratic Party. And so there's obviously issues within DSA about whether or not, what kind of break, if a break even is necessary, with the Democratic Party, if there's the potential to reform that, which I don't think that there is. But also even programmatically, if it's really a socialist in what I would consider socialism, right? Wanting to take over the government as a means of being able to ultimately get to a point where workers are controlling the means of production, or either via, public ownership of the commanding heights, as we might call them, and then general cooperative ownership of non-commanding heights enterprises that can interact either through some kind of democratic planning or even a highly controlled and constrained market or whatever. How do you kind of see the organizational question of like where DSA could go, and is DSA really the vehicle to do it?
I think, it's very likely in my mind that just because of how organizations have worked historically, that, yeah, there will be splits at some point, I'm guessing, but I don't think we have to like work that out ahead of time. Like, what I don't think is that the task is to set up some rival organization to DSA. Like I said, I think there are problems in DSA that need to be worked through, but those are the problems of the socialist movement generally. Those are not unique to DSA as an organization. That is, they are inherent to the state of the movement. And so, like, yeah, in the working through of those issues, it's very possible that there become organizational splits that happen. But that's sort of, it's not for me, I don't think, to like presage what should happen in that regard. Like, obviously the best is always that the revolutionaries win out just overwhelmingly, and there's not even a split because just everyone agrees with us. But that's rarely how things go. So, I think, so yeah, having like more unity is always better, but it has to be real political unity. You can't sort of just force it. And so I think, and I guess I disagree with the stages framing of like, first you need a social democratic stage and then like a genuinely socialist stage. I guess, to me, that's a bit too mechanical, in that, like, I think the way things actually develop are not based on sort of how you would, like what you would put forward first in an argument or trying to win someone to a position or whatever. That is a totally separate question to like the direction, the like dynamics of how things develop in organizations or whatever. So I think, it's true. I would not start my like trying to convince someone of socialism with, I want to make private ownership of companies illegal or whatever. But yeah, I think that the necessity for the revolutionary Marxist wing of the socialist movement to make its position, to differentiate itself and to make its position clear, I think that's necessary at every stage. That's not like a thing to put off. And I think I think similar debates are why I disagree with different sections of DSA about the question of the Democrats, in that I think there are people who think like, okay, well, right now the step is like we run inside the Democrats, and then that like will intensify the contradictions and blow this thing up. And then at a later stage, when that has sort of come to fruition, that's when the question of, preparing the ground for a new party comes in. Whereas I don't see it that way. I see it as at every stage, we need to be openly arguing and putting forward the need for a new party. And even if we're still in the stage of running within the Democrats, that actually doesn't take away our obligation to be politically clear about that our goal here is to launch a new party, to have political independence from the parties of capital. And that, that's the whole point of what we're trying to do. I think like we need to be clear both internally and externally about that. That doesn't mean that we, have to be tactically rigid because of that. Like we can still, if we think that what's needed tactically to like get the exposure or legitimacy or whatever is to run candidates and challenge within Democratic primaries as one of the tactics, like fine, like that's not the hill I want to die on. Like I think that, yeah, let's do that, but but we can't. I think we have to be principled as we're doing it. That means being politically honest the entire time, and in my opinion, it means finding every opportunity for and putting a premium on, yeah, running candidates outside the Democratic Party, trying to show the point a way forward to be able to do that, and yeah, regardless of what you're actually doing, making clear that that's the goal.
Yeah.
And so I think similarly, yeah, so that's on the party question, but I think similarly, like I am not in favor of DSA being a social democratic organization. I am in favor of it being a big tent organization with with free open space for many tendencies to debate and argue for their position. And I want to win it to my position. I recognize my position as a minority position currently. And so I don't think, it makes sense for me to go like split off and have some separate organization where I can be the big fish in a little pond or whatever. I would rather be the little fish in the big pond trying to grow my school of fish or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that, and so I think this came up like in the debates around the DSA program to some extent or whatever. Like there were, I think the program is unfortunately like there are things in it that are reformist or hint in a reformist direction at least or whatever, but it's also I thought it was largely pretty good. Like I have critiques, but I think like overall it was pretty good in the sense of what was adopted being leaving space for different tendencies. Like it didn't try to have one tendency sort of like win or whatever. It tried to sort of leave space for the different tendencies to keep hashing things out and not sort of artificially through organizational measures be like, this is the position of the organization now when the organization hasn't actually come to a consensus around the position. So
I think you'd say, if you're interested in advancing the socialist agenda, whatever you might define that as, involving yourself in DSA as a place to do that, makes sense. Like if you're trying to be outside of it, you're not really talking to the people for whom, are being introduced to ideas and who are potentially ripe to come to your space. If your initial position is, oh, like fuck DSA because it's not sufficiently revolutionary for me, and so come to my little party, that doesn't seem like a recipe for large scale growth, if not success.
Yeah, I think even if you're in an independent, like there are advantages to being in an independent party, but even then, I think politically you would have a responsibility to be highly engaged with DSA and care about what its positions are and what it's doing and like try and help it grow in a good direction. Like even if I wasn't a member, and I would still think that was important. And so one way, or for me personally, it makes more sense. Like the organizational conclusion I draw from that is it makes more sense to be organized as a caucus within DSA, but that's not the primary thing. That's a tactical question, an organizational question. But the principle in my mind is that, like, yeah, you have to be vying for your ideas where the action is or whatever, and you can't sort of just go off and do your own thing and ignore that.
So maybe there seems like a contradiction, though, if I think about it, in terms of even DSA, right? Because I think, in some sense, an advantage of DSA is exactly as you describe. It's this place in which the important discussions are being had, and that movement in the larger kind of socialist movement, as sort of at least embodied in some ways by DSA or represented by DSA in some ways. It's a good space to have the kind of discussions, to figure out some tactical things and to work that out with other people who are at least similarly politically inclined, depending on, because it is so big tent, there's a lot of diversity, so you don't always know. But I think there is a disadvantage in the fact that you cannot, it is not at least in a position, and it may never be in a position to propose a plan to have a platform in a way that will say, if you're a DSA candidate, and I think this is something that you've advocated, or at least Reform and Revolution advocated, if you're a DSA candidate, your positions are like, there's a list of things you say, well, I'm going to vote this way on this issue, and we're going to vote this way on this issue, and like, and that the party needs to be able to like have a control on that, to be able to say that if you don't vote that way, we're not. It's not just an endorsement of like a Democratic candidate. It's like that you are a party member, a party candidate. There's a party program, and you gotta, if you're on board, you're a DSA candidate, and if you're not, you're not. And it's obviously, I don't think that that's the case now. Obviously, it's pretty like, if you're a DSA candidate, if you say you're a DSA candidate, DSA doesn't hate you, and so that is a significant disadvantage, right? But if you're gonna have, if it's the space where you can have all these differences of opinion, stuff like that, coalescing around those is going to be significantly difficult. And so, how do you kind of reconcile that just seemingly contradiction?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. First, I think on just to acknowledge up front, yes, there are both advantages and disadvantages to being in DSA or to being in organizing yourself around a more narrow, independent, around a more narrow ideology and in an independent way, rather than doing that as a caucus in DSA. I think, and one of the biggest advantages of being outside DSA would be the ability to take independent action without having to sort of, convince a broader group to come along in that direction. You can just sort of take initiatives openly as yourself without having to debate and win over a bunch of other people to do it or whatever. And so that is a genuine advantage. And so I don't want to downplay that. And that's why I say it's a tactical question. I think even then, though, you still would want to be, even if you were going to take that type of independent action, you would still politically want to be trying to win DSA to support that or whatever. And you would want to, I think you can't, I think it's totally a dereliction of duty to not try and engage with and win the largest section of the socialist movement, like towards what you're doing, making attempts to do that at least. And so, but yeah, sometimes it might be, you could make a valid argument that sometimes the best way to convince people is but to lead by example and show it can be done and whatever, and that is a way you could, if you're trying to influence DSA, that you could do it. So I'm not discounting that as a thing. I'm not critiquing people who are independent, but more critiquing people who are, I would say, sectarian towards DSA or whatever, like that they don't, or dismiss DSA and don't fully understand the importance of winning it. But also, I think on the question of DSA itself growing into an organization where you can have more of a clear program for candidates, more clear accountability, this has been like a discussion that's been absolutely raging within DSA in the recent period, where the big controversy is over Jamal Bowman's vote in favor of increased funding to Israel's Iron Dome missile defense project. And so there's just been a ton of debate around that's ongoing, where, you know, there was a section of people that called for that Jamal Bowman should be expelled for that vote, and another section saying that we shouldn't. And the ultimate decision so far, at least it seems from the National Political Committee, is to, I think, well, first off, I should say DSA is virtually unanimous in the idea that that vote was wrong and bad. So, has been proclaimed guilty on that, I would say. But the debate is around basically, what do you do about it? And so some people are saying, yeah, it's expulsion. There's other people that I would say are sort of throwing up their hands and going, well, there's not much we can do at this stage. We're not strong enough, to do that. We just need to build and grow, and, whatever, sort of what I would say is sort of a hand wavy attitude towards it. And I think this is a really important discussion. And personally, I would, if I had to put myself in one of those two camps, I would go towards the we need to take action camp, not the we can't do anything about it camp. But I also, expulsion feels kind of weak, actually. Like, it feels like
it's not going to get him out of office.
Yeah, and do we want him out of office? Like, it's not like his his opponent was better or something like that.
Mhm.
I mean, and do we want like like does Jamal Bowman care about being expelled? Frankly, like is it, or is it letting him off the hook? Is it like, oh,
Right.
phew, now I don't have to listen to DSA anymore, and to just do my own thing or whatever. And so like like politically, I completely agree. Like that it is an absolutely inexcusable thing to vote for. That just on basic principle, I think he was unprincipled in doing it. He bent to pressure from the Zionist lobby, and pretty explicitly, saying like that. Yeah, I mean, I am pro-Palestine, but I just can't stand up. Or not. There's just overwhelming public opinion in this direction, and this is not the hill I want to die on, or whatever. Need to build more support first, or whatever. And so yeah, I think that's totally wrong, unprincipled. That is a blatantly unprincipled position. It needs to be called out as such. That as socialists we should be, if nothing, like one of the number one things is never ever support imperialist military ventures of any kind. And so on that political point, I totally agree. But I think in terms of what you do about it, I think it would be much stronger, for instance, to have, if DSA were to hold, and I think it should do this more in general on various things, could hold like a public town hall where it like invites, or like not invites, but basically makes clear to its electeds that like, okay, you're expected to be here and be part of this town hall. And I think it should be made clear to candidates, in advance, that when they are going to be called upon periodically to do these types of things if they want the endorsement. And that yeah, you should, Bowman and frankly AOC as well, who voted present on that vote, which is half as bad practically, but just as unprincipled in my mind, in that the only principled thing would be a clear no on that vote. And so anyway, like that Bowman and AOC should be there, but also people who voted the right way on that, like Rashida Tlaib, and also just Palestinian activists, members of DSA, that it should be, you should have to go through the gauntlet basically of answering. And I think that would, well, if that doesn't get any movement from him, then, expulsion's still on the table. It's not, you can still do that. And I think it would be much more powerful and meaningful to expel on the basis of like a natural polarization that arises in the course of heated discussion or whatever with the representative.
That's that nice middle ground too, between this like extreme thing of expulsion and then the extreme of doing nothing, right? It's like, okay, let's have some measure of accountability.
Well, and to me, the reason it's not because I think expulsion's too extreme, it's because I think it's too weak.
Yeah.
I think like it doesn't do much.
Yeah.
Like I'm for the politically strongest thing possible. I think that is a very clear-cut political issue, and DSA needs to take a clear political stand. I'm not convinced immediate expulsion would be the right way to do that.
And in the day of age where like a statement that you make is making news, a town hall in which you force politicians to answer questions that they wouldn't have to answer in any kind of other forum is going to get even the attraction of a CNN or something like that, because like, wow, look at like an actual political discussion is happening. We have to cover it.
Yes, it puts DSA on the map in a bigger way than to just do a unilateral expulsion.
Yeah, it makes them look like a real political organization.
That politicians have to come and answer to this organization.
Yep.
I mean, it would provide a sort of counterpoint to the fact that another thing Bowman did after that vote was do a public town hall with J Street, which is like the liberal wing of the Zionist lobby or whatever, where they're not as bad as they're not AIPAC, but
right.
They're anti-occupation and whatever, but still sort of pro religious state or whatever, and so anyway, I think like the fact that he did a J Street town hall, it's not that that's bad that he did that. I think it's all about what you put forward at the town halls, but I think it's a very straightforward ask at this point to, okay, you did this town hall for this organization you're not a part of. now do one for this other organization that you're supposedly a part of. And, obviously if he's like, no, I want no part of that, then the case for expulsion becomes a lot clearer. But
Yeah.
Anyway, I just think like these are the types of things where I think people want these organizational shortcuts to these problems. Like if we just adopt the right rules, where if this bad thing happens and if you go against us, then that's how we like hold people accountable. Whereas I think the main way you're going to hold people accountable is through genuine political consensus on an issue and making it politically costly for people to go against it. Like the reason he was able to do that is because of the overwhelming political consensus.
Exactly. It's what the Democrats do. Like that is not something I disagree with the Democrat. The Democratic Party is very good at getting people to fucking stand in line. They've got whips and stuff like that. I don't agree with what they do, where they're whipping people towards, but this, when you can tell a politician there's a political cost to taking this decision, that their calculation in terms of what they're going to do is going to change, and that's a strength, not a weakness.
Yep. Yeah. And so I mean, he should have to know that, and so that means getting more cohesion internally, and it also means finding ways to. One of the reasons I think it should be a public town hall is I think we need to educate the public on the issue. I think like that ultimately as long as it is a small minority position, you're gonna have more people defecting on that issue, as long as they feel like I can't get elected again if I take this, stance or whatever. And so, I mean, I think we do have to be at the same time. That's not an excuse for taking the position. It's still wrong, but just to be realistic about what happens, that a certain chunk of people are gonna defect on an issue like that. But yeah, if you make it politically costly in the other direction, where like, yeah, you're going to get blowback from your voters if you if you go that way on this, that also helps.
Yeah. All right. So as we're approaching the 2-hour mark, which is, again, I hardly believe it, because I just enjoy having these. We could probably talk for 6 hours if we wanted to, but to maybe do a kind of quick fire as much as this would be possible. I know I've sent you a few of these. These are ideas of potential positions, or like larger strategic kind of programs or things that, like propositions that I would be curious just to get your kind of even a potential quick, not necessarily hot, but quick take on in some ways.
All right. Quick fire is not my strength, but I'll do my best.
Yeah, neither is it mine as we again get into the 2 hours. But I think so. Specifically, when you look at the example of Russia and the revolution in from 1905 into the two in 1917, the position of the Soviet is crucial. That in the breakdown of first the Tsarist system, and then in the all but collapse of the Tsarist system into the fickleness of the provisional government sort of bourgeois system, you had this other organ of political and economic power, which was the Soviet, which was sort of what enabled the Bolsheviks to eventually just not have to worry about constituent assemblies and things like that, and to just all power to the Soviets, and it was the ability to have there was the question then, and I think there is even in some ways. Obviously, we don't have a Soviet, but there's sort of two linked questions of the utility and or the limitations of running candidates in the current political system, as unpopular, as fickle, as feckless as it is, and as potentially even as a fetter that it is. The sort of utility of and the strategic and tactical utility of running candidates in that system, actually vying for elections and trying to change individual policies. Should that work be done? And two, if the answer is yes, what is the overall purpose? Is the overall purpose to bring out the contradictions, or is the overall purpose attempting to try to do what is in principle possible in a like liberal democracy like we have in the United States, as compared to obviously like a Tsarist Duma that could be immediately, that could be just dissolved by the Tsar, or a provisional government that never actually had a legislature, like one that had any kind of political legitimacy. So I mean, obviously there's a question of what political legitimacy the current system has, but I mean, it can make laws and those laws do get enforced. So it has some legitimacy. So the first question, this leads into the second question, but the strategic and tactical position on running candidates, what should we and what is it for? The second part of it being, as maybe a different plan, the idea of organizing new political bodies that would act as rivals. So potentially like different city councils, like a sort of, again, workers' council for like, but a new city council that like would be able to have people meet and sort of go out there and say, do this, and to have some, if there's some way of building up legitimacy of that, where that those things be like the decrees or the laws or whatever it is that are passed by this rival city council or political organization are the ones that are actually adhered to, rather than the ones of the traditional established, juridical embodied political forces. So you could have rival city councils or economic coordinating committees, even Occupy organizations that are able to say like, hey, do this, or we're going to protest your business, right? And we're not going to allow you to do business. And so that way you can kind of force compliance, ultimately to bring about a dual power system, where ultimately there's a question with where actual political legitimacy and political power rests. And if you can grow the political legitimacy of the rival institution, it can be a political position of either candidates or outside organizations to say, why are we dealing with this old, stupid, political organization that is technically constitutionally the organized one, but has no actual power? So those are obviously big questions, but I'm curious, the kind of thoughts you have right away.
Yeah. I'm going to link them and probably focus on the second one first, in that I think, so first off, I think if I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, I think I probably disagree with how you're framing dual power and how it comes about, in that I think the Soviets were not something that was set up by the radical left wing of the workers' movement. These were organic developments that came out of the course of struggle. The Bolsheviks actually originally had a sectarian attitude towards the Soviets, and it took Lenin being like, no, what are you doing, to like get them to shake up their view of that, or whatever. And so I think like I question the utility of sort of in advance of when these things are sort of called for by the logic of the stage of struggle, like trying to set up these shell bodies or whatever that can play that role. I think it makes more sense to cross that bridge when you get to that stage. Not, I mean, politically preparing the ground for that, yes, in general, like arguing for the need for that. But I think like trying to sort of substitute oneself as like, the existing radical left that believes in that and just set it up yourself or whatever, rather substitute yourself in doing that for the broader movement. I don't think I agree with that.
The kind of Blanquiist, the thing that Lenin is often actually wrongly suggested he was, but it was actually opposed. It wasn't jumping ahead of the workers. It was in some ways following them.
And then so when it comes to the Bolsheviks and I also just think it's important to make clear that even when they were calling for all power to the Soviets, and even when in some ways you had the Soviets in the dominant position, they were still running candidates for the Duma. They were still engaging with the Constituent Assembly. So like the main reason for the Soviets, it wasn't that even then they still saw the utility of engaging with these reactionary czarist institutions. And so I think that flows into why I think it's worthwhile to engage in those realms. Not in literally every situation, but there are times when it makes sense to boycott them. But I think the vast majority of the time it does make sense to engage with every sort of avenue that's given. And I think the reason for that is because it's the same reason to engage in a strike or a Black Lives Matter movement or whatever, which is it's a way that people are trying to do something. It's one of the dominant ways that people see, like if that's the sort of way that's shown as legitimate to you, like of trying to change things, is you go through this system, you try and get these people elected that have these positions, and that's how you make change. And I don't believe that's how change happens. I think that, I don't think that we're going to get the change we need through the electoral system. But there are people, we have to recognize the accomplished fact that there are people struggling in that arena. And so do I want to leave those people to just the existing influences of the bourgeois and middle class, or do I want there to be, you know, a working class wing of that struggle that has its own independent voice and puts forward its own positions and program? And I want the latter. So to me, like, the reason to struggle in that arena is the same as the reason to involve oneself in any of the other potential arenas of struggle, which is just that people are trying to make reforms there. And I think it's through the struggle for partial reforms that you're going to develop the forces capable of making a revolution, the forces that are going to fill out the Soviets of the future. But they're not going to get there, in my mind, by counterposing in the short term a workers' council or whatever to the existing political structure. You're going to have to go through the process with them of challenging the existing political
structure. If you get into political
office
office and you're doing your, like, you have this like kind of legitimacy that comes with being elected in the current system. You get that legitimacy. You attempt to do the things you can, and I think in our system it would be you're almost like it's almost impossible for it to actually happen. These inability for the system as it currently is constituted to actually do what it needs to do creates the means by which people are going to be looking for alternatives and creating those kind of alternatives. And
but what's crucial is that you have to be warning the whole time that that's the case.
Yeah.
What you cannot do is like get into power being like, elect me, we'll fix all the things.
The SPD.
And then like, you just can't.
Yeah.
You know, that is a recipe for the opposite. That's a recipe for disillusioning people, making them get despair and flee into the arms of the fascists, or
at worst, when the revolutionary moment comes, you are the ones who send in the Free Corps to go,
or that, but yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of Syriza in Greece or whatever, where like, you know, they came to power, but clearly did not have an accurate conception of what it would take. Whenever they were not willing to take the steps that were needed to actually fight international capital on the questions of austerity. And so, they end up presiding over austerity or whatever. And so I think that like, that is what you absolutely don't want to do. And again, this is where I think I diverge from some of the other trends in DSA that I tend to agree with on a lot of things. But I think there's a lot of people who basically think like, okay, right now we're just trying to intensify the contradictions, and then, you know, once those come to a head, that's when we can put forward the other stuff. And I just don't think it works that way. I think you gotta, the whole time, even as you're intensifying the contradictions, you have to already be preparing for those crises to resolve in favor of the working class in the direction you want them to resolve. You can't sort of wait till the last minute to do that. Is my view.
So related to that, we have a constitutional system that has a mechanism by which that constitutional system can legally within itself be reformed. And so there is obviously just what has been seemed like an impossibility of having Congress actually do it on anything of actual substance. But there is also an ability to call a majority of the states to have constitutional referendums and propose amendments and have those amendments voted on by a referendum and have those become, as long as there's a majority of the states, be able to significantly change the political structure of the country. And in that sense, in some ways, even the economic structure, because the two are invariably linked. There's also the example that we have in the United States of having a constitutional system, calling a sort of council to look at reforming that or proposing different ways of amending it. And in the course of it, pretty quickly realizing that whole system doesn't work, chucking the baby out with the bathwater, coming up with a new system, and then relatively using a lot of different strategies to all but ram it down people's throats and force a kind of compliance. As I think somewhat dubious as the second one it is the example, and it has always been somewhat ironic to me that there is such a fetishization of the Constitution, given that it was a kind of coup in terms of its actual the actual historical process by which it came out. Do you think that any kind of proposition to use something like that as a means of getting what Bernie might call a political revolution, at minimum something like, disallowing private donations in campaigns or something like that, to at minimum kind of alter the the obvious corrupt nature of our current political system. Is that strategically, in your view, a worthwhile activity? Do you think it's like a sort of fool's errand, or what's your position on that?
I think it depends. I mean, I don't think that's fundamentally how change is going to happen, but I think if there becomes a popular movement for a constitutional reform of one form or another that seems good, we should 100% support it and get behind it, and should not poo-poo it from the sidelines, but should be part of that fight.
Do you think we should propose it?
But yeah, I'm skeptical personally of that is the thing that makes the most sense to propose in the immediate term. I think mainly because I'm skeptical that it will get mass response or whatever. Obviously, I could be wrong, and someone could try and put it forward, and it gets a mass response, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, and I will adapt accordingly. But like, my view is I'm skeptical that people will see that as realistic, given how hard it is for the governments or the states or whatever to agree on things as it is, given the narrow margins on most things. Like, I feel like the majorities that you need to do these constitutional things seem even more far off than the majorities needed to pass these things through the existing system, the existing legislatures and whatnot. So I just, I'm guessing that anyone who's looking towards process is going to see that as more far-fetched than other.
That's legitimate. I mean,
what I would put personally, the thing I would put the emphasis on in the short term, I think one of the lowest hanging fruits maybe is trying to pressure Biden on the student loan forgiveness issue, just because that's something he has no excuse on. He can unilaterally do it.
Yeah.
And because I think right now, like, whatever, like, obviously there's a million things to critique Biden on in terms of his failure to actually fight for what he proposed in the Build Back Better bill, that, like, let that thing totally get killed, because he was not willing to actually do what was necessary to pass it. And frankly, if we're being honest, neither were Bernie and AOC and whatever.
Sure.
Like, I mean, they, in terms of parliamentary procedure, they did the right thing, but they didn't make any attempt to build a movement. They didn't call a protest or.
Which is super frustrating, given the fact that they both said that was like a way that they were thinking. You know, it's like, oh, so you're only going to do that if you're president? What the fuck? Like,
right? Not me, us. You know, it should
what
be.
The hell happened?
To me, like, that was the big failure. Like, I think that was the thing that had the potential to change the dynamics, would be if these major national figures like Bernie or AOC, like, were to put out the call, saying, like, followers around the country, like, go have
given people
demonstrations
the
and you know, don't let this pass by without, you know, that was the time to pull out all the stops. I feel like more so than the force the vote thing, which I thought that was a bit weird because it wasn't going to make a difference, but this would have made it, like, this is where you do everything.
And you can get a lot of different people to come around in this movement. Like, this is a multicultural, multiracial, it's affecting anybody who went to college, basically.
And so this is one where, like, and it'd be seen as more like this is winnable because it's something that the president, you know,
can do.
It's his flagship thing. And so it's like, you know, you sort of end up calling their bluff or whatever, or they might not be willing to actually fight for it, but you are, like, it's often the case that, like, the revolutionaries make the best reformists, or like, are the best at winning reforms.
Well, and sometimes you don't even need a candidate to for the system to express its contradictions, because a ridiculous organization like the Democratic Party will do it for you.
But I mean, the Democrats are being pretty great at if it's just a matter of exposing contradictions, the Democratic Party is doing a great job of that.
All right, so the last thing I want to talk to you about, partially because I think it's related to something close to home for you. I mean, you're in Portland, and so is the question of, you know, we're seeing a rise of violence, frankly, political violence, in terms of street fights and, you know, the Proud Boys and January 6th and even reactions to it in terms of Antifa, depending on how, you know, in different places at different times, you'll see people who will black bloc and look like Antifa, as nebulous an organization as Antifa is, engaging in street violence and street fighting with organizations. And obviously in Portland, it's like been ongoing for a long time, and it has flare-ups and fits and starts, but it's like this kind of low-level situation. I'm wondering how you kind of feel about that. There's a part of me that feels like that actually kind of emboldens the right wing, and that it gives a boogeyman for people. Antifa has obviously become a boogeyman for a lot of people and stuff like that. And so I'm wondering, obviously you don't want to just not respond at all. So the question is, how do you respond, and the right kind of tactic to respond? And to me, a large scale, potentially less physically confrontational organization would potentially both optically and organizationally and strategically be a better way to fight that. But I also can see that there's a certain section of the left, one that frankly there's a bit of cosplaying as a revolutionary, but there's also just the frustration with the fact that it seems like the militant right wing is better armed, better organized, and more willing and able to do, some pretty hardcore stuff that does have a kind of old school, or what might somebody see as a kind of a revolutionary thing. It was those crazy right wing guys who took over a building a couple of years ago, in Oregon, or it was in Oregon, right, or like Idaho or something. I can't remember. There's those cattle rancher guys. I can't remember, Bundy or what's it, right? Mm-hmm. So that's like, you see that and you're like, wow, like, and the amount of gusto, if nothing else, and what seems like almost revolutionary in the sense of like going into the fucking Capitol and stuff like that, right? I can understand wanting to be like, we need to be just as hardcore, but I don't think that that's ultimately a strategy that's going to confer legitimacy and really do much good. But I wonder how you feel, seeing as like those street fights and stuff are happening in your town.
Yeah, I mean, I think I broadly agree. I think that the way you need to absolutely fight the rise of the far right. It's happening because of the same, in part of the same reasons of the rise of socialist forces or whatever, like that there's just a general polarization in society, and emptying out of the middle, and a building up of political sentiment at the polls. But I think that like the way you're going to defeat it is ultimately going to have to be political and on a mass basis. It's like, I don't think that the way you're going to defeat it is because of a few heroic people fighting in the streets or whatever. I think that doesn't do anything to combat the social foundations of fascism. And of course, I'm all for self-defense of communities or whatever. Like, I'm not saying let the fascists trample all over you or whatever, like fight back and defend yourself. And when you have demos, like have provisions for defense. But I think you want to be seen as, I think, like you said, having a mass response based in the labor movement if possible, and these sort of larger forces that are able to, like, it's much more powerful if there's just like a handful of fascists that show up, and then they're just overwhelmed by community response and sort of, run out of town and run away with their tail between their legs or whatever. That's ideal. And then, of course, if they still decide to be stupid and start crap anyway, even though they're totally outnumbered, then of course you gotta defend yourself, disarm them, to deal with the threat. But yeah, I think the main sort of way to inoculate against those forces is going to be to positively build up the forces on the left and in the labor movement, and to try to, insofar as you're fighting the fascists physically, it needs to be in defense of these broader forces or whatever. Not like you don't want to be seen as like, oh, I'm going out there to start some shit so I can look revolutionary or whatever. You want it to be clearly from a standpoint of defense of the community and of the movement. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I broadly agree with what you're saying about that. I think it's not out of any less urgency to combat it. It's just, I'm not convinced that the sort of small scale street battles are
useful,
doing much to stop it from.
I hear you. All right. Well, there was part of me that thought that maybe there would be more disagreement in the terms of this discussion, but I think ultimately, it's a way to have discussions about how you see things and what that does to inform your strategy. And I think for the most part, you and I are in agreement, and that's obviously just because we're right now. But like, it's but no, I mean, I think it's about the perspective, and I think, you know, again, you and I have, in many ways, we came from a similar place in the country. We're around the same age. We were involved in the same organization. We've seen the same kind of things have an effect on us in the same time. It's helped to orient ourselves in the kind of positions that will, I think, find more agreement than will disagreement. And so it is always a pleasure to talk to you about all these kinds of things. I always sort of learn things and am, I think, appropriately checked or appropriately agreed to, you know, and I'm always happy to have those discussions. And so, you know, this'll, I think it's just an example, hopefully, for other people to show that you can have discussions about important things, both without using significant amounts of jargon, though we did talk about Lenin, I guess, a little bit.
We used jargon. I mean, let's be honest, we use a lot of jargon.
Yeah,
but
I suppose so, but not in a way that I think is so out of the like so far from reality that you wouldn't know what we were talking about. And so
one can hope. But,
yeah, I mean, it's a socialist podcast.
Whenever you've got two people who have enough similar background, you start using shortcuts.
That's true. Yes, I suppose so. But you know, if I guess if you're listening to this and don't know what the hell we're talking about, email me, let me know, and I'll do a better job. I'll do a follow-up episode to explain what we were talking about.
I'll also just do a quick plug myself that I'm a member of the Reform and Revolution Caucus of DSA, and we've got both a digital and a print magazine and a website. So if you want to search that, reformandrevolution.org, and subscribe, or if you're interested, if you like the ideas that I've been putting forward and that we've been talking about, we're definitely trying to grow our influence and forces in DSA. And so if you have similar thoughts about direction to take DSA, definitely look us up, and we'd love to talk to you.
Yeah, I'll say at least in the meetings that I've had, I'm in Vermont right now, so not in the thick of things, but in the discussions I've had, in the meeting I've had, I think I've both consciously and even vocally represented many of the positions of the Reform and Revolution Caucus in the small groups that we're having here. And so playing my part, because I think I'm, again, as shown in this discussion, relatively in agreement with most of, if not all, the positions of Reform and Revolution Caucus in DSA, as a DSA member as well. So and I read the publication, so
appreciate your support.
Pay my dues, yeah. All right, Brandon, I really appreciate it, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Kevin.
All right,
it's been
man.
a pleasure.
Take it easy.
Take it easy.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right, see you next time.